So I want to start off this fourth sermon in the Advent season with a picture, and kind of an odd picture. But if you think about it, what does it say to you? Here's two people going fishing, and one person's got a rod and a line, and this guy's got a net. But look at that net. And here's the word I want you to think about today at the beginning of this message, and that is the word expectations. This guy has a different expectation than this guy. You see it? And here's kind of the message or the point I want you to see. Our conduct, how we live our lives, is many times influenced by, shaped by our expectations. What do you anticipate is going to happen? And what do you do when it happens, when it doesn't happen? Your expectations will many times influence the way you live out your life. Here's an example of this that really fits the season. There is one day out of the year, one day out of 365 days when you do not have to tell your children to wake up. And what is that day? It's Christmas Day. If your tradition is to open gifts on Christmas Day, when you put your kids to bed the night before, you do not have to tell them to get up the next morning. They might be up at 3:30. They might be up at 4 o'clock, waking you up when you're not ready to get up. But because of their expectations of what that day means, their conduct is shaped by that. And the point is, expectations influence us. Expectations influence how vibrantly, how excitedly we enter into something. Let me give you another example of this that is about an actress that you've probably never heard of. Her name was Helen Hayes. She had a pretty phenomenal career, acting career, 82 years. She started acting at age 5. She was born in the year 1900, and at age 5 she started acting. She was both a Broadway actress as well as a movie actress. And something else that's true about Helen Hayes that she admitted, was that she was a terrible cook. She always had somebody else cook for her. But one year at Thanksgiving, she decided she was going to fix all of the dinner, all of the Thanksgiving dinner. And in fact, she started very early that Thanksgiving morning, pulling things together, preparing the meal, hours worked on it. But about 30 minutes to an hour before the meal was to be completed, she brought her husband and son into the kitchen, and she made this declaration to them. She said, "Look, this may not come out exactly the way you want it. If it's not a good turkey, I don't want you to say anything about it. Don't say anything. Without any comment, let's just stand up from the table and we'll go to the nearest restaurant and eat." She knew she wasn't a good cook. So she sends them out of the kitchen. She finalizes her preparations. About 30 minutes later, she walks into the dining room carrying the turkey that she has prepared. And when she gets there, her husband and her son are seated at the dining room table with their coats and hats already on. In other words, they didn't expect this to be very good. Expectations influence decisions that we make about our lives and how we're going to live our lives. And so today I want to take this word expectations and I want to bring it to a story in the Bible, a Christmas, part of the Christmas story, the story about the wise men. And I want to talk about their expectations. So let's go to Matthew chapter 2 and look at the story about them. It says, Starts out verse 1. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Okay, Bethlehem is 6 miles south of Jerusalem. So Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea. Jerusalem was also in Judea, but this was during the reign of King Herod. About that time, within that time frame period, there were some wise men, magi, Persian astrologers, you could call them. They were from eastern lands, from the east, probably from ancient Persia, and they arrived not in Bethlehem, but they arrived in Jerusalem asking a question. Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east, and we've come to worship him. Now, there are different ways that scholars have looked at this, biblical scholars, but what I think makes the most sense and what I have read and researched is that these magi were stargazers. They studied the movement of stars and planets, and they were always looking for signs. And there was a certain configuration of planets that came together that kind of made what almost looked like a mega star in the sky. And the way they interpreted it is that something big is happening in Judah, in Judea, in Israel. In fact, a mega king has been born. And because they put a tremendous amount of value, these guys are not Christians, but they put a tremendous amount of value in what they saw in the stars. So they traveled maybe anywhere from 500 to 1,000 miles from Persia, wherever they were in ancient Persia. They come to Israel looking for a mega king, but they don't go to Bethlehem because they don't have any notion that he would have been born in Bethlehem. Where do they go? They go to Jerusalem. They go to the palace in Jerusalem. They go to King Herod's palace because where's a mega king going to be born? He's going to be born in a palace, a king's palace. That's where the king will be. Well, when they come and they start talking about all this stuff, King Herod was bothered by what they were saying. We know that King Herod was paranoid. You know, he killed, records, history tells us he killed his sons and he killed some of his wives when he perceived them to be a threat to his throne. So obviously, if somebody says, well, we've come to find this new mega king that's been born, you can see how that really bothers him. So he calls a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of the religious law, and he says, they must be talking about this Messiah that we've been looking for generations. Maybe the Messiah has been born. So what do the scriptures say about where this Messiah was to be born? And they said he would be born in Bethlehem. When the Messiah comes, he will be born in Bethlehem, in Judea, for this is what the prophet wrote. So these magi were close, 6 miles off. And so Herod says to them, I want you to go down to Bethlehem. You find this mega king that's been born, and you come back and tell me about him because I want to go and worship him too, which was, of course, a lie. And so they make the journey, six more miles. They traveled months, perhaps, to get to Israel. And now they travel a few more days or a day or so down to Bethlehem. And this is what they find. Now, this is where I want you to think about expectations. What do you think they were expecting? They were expecting to find this king born in a palace in Jerusalem. But it's not what they expected. They come down to Bethlehem, and what do they find? They find a baby in cheap clothes, teenage mother, living pretty much on the poverty level, actually even living most likely in a relative's house in Bethlehem. Mary and Joseph are from Nazareth. They come south for other reasons. There's a longer part of the story. They're living probably in a relative's house. And here's the thing I want you to see for these Magi. I want you to try to enter into their minds. And what I'm talking about is not written in the Bible. I know this. But what would they have been thinking? This was not what they expected. And this is definitely putting words in their head, but maybe they were even disappointed. Definitely, it wasn't what they expected. Here's the mini lesson I want you to see in this story right up front, is that many times in life, the way things turn out will be different than what we expect. This is the way of life. Many times things that happen to us are not what we maybe even wanted, certainly not what we expected, and sometimes maybe even a disappointment to us. But I want you to see this, that the Bible is very clear about this truth, that both from God and the Bible, there is no promise that life is going to be perfect. In fact, let me show you how this is taught in different parts of the Bible in different ways. For example, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9, the Apostle Peter's writing a letter to a group of Christians who are being persecuted. And he says to them in chapter 5, verse 8, be sober-minded. Keep your head on straight. Be watchful. Keep your eyes open. Keep your ears to the ground. Why? Because you have an adversary. The devil, Satan, hates you. Satan wants to destroy you. He prowls around like a roaring lion seeking for someone to devour. In this life, there are going to be things that happen to us that we don't want, that we don't expect, that we don't like. And it's not God that's doing it to us. It's Satan that's doing this to us. That's verse 8. Verse 9, he says, so I want you to resist Satan. Stand against him. Stand firm in your faith. Stand against Satan. Knowing what? Knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brothers throughout the world. Sometimes there's a temptation when we go through difficulties to think, I'm the only person who's suffering. I'm the only one who's going through hardship. I'm the only one for whom life is not turning out the way I wanted it to. And what the Bible wants you to see and understand in this passage is that when bad things happen to you, it's not God that's doing it, it's Satan that's doing it, number one. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. In fact, what Peter's trying to get them to see is if you follow Jesus, sometimes it will be harder than if you didn't. If you run with the devil isn't going to bother you. But you come against the devil, you start living for Jesus, well, and you'll have hardship. This hardship does not mean that God has stopped loving you. Hardship does not mean that God doesn't exist. It means this is sometimes just a part of life, especially if you're a follower of Jesus. In James is the half-brother of Jesus, and he wrote in his epistle, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, not if, but when you meet trials of various kinds. In other words, there's going to be disappointment in life. Things are going to happen to you that you didn't want, that you couldn't see initially that there could be any value in it. But what I want you to know is that trials will come. Paul says almost the same kind of thing in Romans chapter 5 when he says, we can rejoice too, not if, but when. I mean, it's going to happen. When we run into problems and trials, life is going to have unexpected, sometimes disappointing things happen. For we know that when we have these problems and trials can help us develop endurance. Now that's certainly, I think if you approach problems and trials with a proper attitude, they will develop your endurance. And endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. So the more I face troubles and trials, and I handle them appropriately, and I'm getting stronger, I'm becoming more enduring, my character is getting stronger, then I begin to believe, you know what? I handled it this way with God's help in the past. I can have a confident hope that He's going to help me in the future as well. In other words, what we can learn is that there are certain lessons we can grasp, and we can grow through troubles and trials in ways that we'd never grow without them. This is a part of life. Disappointment is a part of life. In this life, you will experience things that you didn't anticipate, and sometimes they will disappoint you in the process. Sometimes, in other words, sometimes you'll follow a star, and it won't be in Jerusalem, it won't be in a palace, it'll be a baby with a mother, a teenage mother, living on the poverty level. It's not what they expected. But here's the thing I think is fascinating about these guys. They see the star in the east. They travel to Jerusalem, not there. Mega King's not there. They travel south to Bethlehem. They find Jesus. And what do? And this is, I think, really important. They entered the house. They saw the child with his mother, Mary. And they bowed down and they worshiped. This circumstance perhaps was not exactly what they would have thought. It was not where they thought. But they see God in this. They worship God. They worship. There's something authoritative about that baby. There's something different about that baby. And honestly, what I want you to see is that this ought to be the way of wise men and wise women of every generation. If you can ever come to the place where you can find God, you can see the hand of God, even in the midst of things that are not what we anticipated, maybe even disappointments, but we can still see God in the midst of this. I think this is what makes us, this is what blessed them. I think this is what can make a difference in our lives as well. And this idea of being able to find God, seek God, even in the midst of disappointment, is all over the Bible. One of the most fascinating stories in the Old Testament is found in the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. Here was a young man in the beginning who, his brothers hated him. His brothers were jealous of him. They were jealous of the attention that their daddy gave to him. And they finally decided one day, we're going to get rid of him. Some of them wanted to kill him, and they eventually sold him to a caravan that was heading to Egypt, and he becomes a slave in Egypt, He's mistreated for decades. He's lied about, he's forgotten, finds himself in jail eventually, and yet one day things turned for him. By the grace of God, he rose to prominence and power in Egypt. And again, I'm taking a long story that covers several chapters in the book of Genesis. Eventually, he's the second in command in all of Egypt, handling the distribution of food during a terrible famine. And his brothers living in Israel, experiencing that famine, they run out of food. They come down to Egypt to get help according to the plan that Joseph has set up. And they get down there and they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And he could have, in that moment, he could have destroyed them. He could have squashed them. But he doesn't want to do that. And he finally reveals himself to them. And there's a climactic statement in this story of Joseph that I want to highlight for you. It's found in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He's talking to his brothers. He's revealed himself to them. He said, look, boys, I know that what you did to me, you wanted evil to come to me. What you did to me was evil. It was wrong. Some of you wanted to kill me. And all of you were willing to sell me to these Midianite traders. But what I want you to see is that God was there. What you intended was evil, but God was in the midst of this. And I think what made Joseph such a good leader is he could see the hand of God even in his life that was not perfect, you know. You see this in the story of Job. Remember, Job was a wealthy man, large family, and again, to take a long story and make it short, God pulls his hand of protection away from Job, and Satan attacks Job with fury. And Job loses his family, and Job loses his possessions. He loses his wealth. He loses his health. He's covered in sores and scabs, and his life is miserable. And his wife turns to him and says, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" You know? And then there's this famous statement by Job. He says, "Look, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away." In this case, it wasn't the Lord that took away, it was Satan that took away. But he said it. This is what he said: "The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And if you take this statement and kind of rework it, what he means is, look, I worshiped God when things were good, and I'm going to worship God when things are bad. He sees God. He sees the hand of God, the presence of God. He seeks God even when his life stinks. That's what made him such a good and a great man. Eventually, things were restored to him at the end of his life. The 23rd Psalm has always been a psalm, very famous and popular psalm, written by David. And most scholars believe that the 23rd Psalm was written during a time when David was being chased, when he was kind of in exile. It could have been when he was running from King Saul. It could have been whenever he was running away from his son Absalom, who wanted to kind of oust him from the throne. But there's a part of the psalm that I want to zero in on, verse 4. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Even though life is not what I would have hoped for, what I would have wanted, it feels like death, it smells like death, but I will fear no evil, because I know that you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So here's again a man for whom life is not turning out maybe as he would have wanted or expected, but he sees God. He seeks God in the midst of his struggle. He doesn't expect that life is going to be all rosy and sweet smelling because he believes in God. But even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will seek the Lord. He looks for God in the hardship and finds peace. You see this also in the Apostle Paul. I mean, when he writes the letter or the book of the Bible that we call Philippians, he's in prison in Rome. He's in jail. He's in shackles. And yet he writes this letter and he says, I've learned how to deal with life. That's what he says in the verses right before this. I've learned how to deal with hardship, and I've learned how to not let success spoil me. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can face the hardship. I can be unhealthy. I can be healthy. I can be wealthy. I can be poor. I can be, my life can be good and my life can be bad. I can do all things because I've learned how to see God and seek God even in the hardship. This is a very powerful and important lesson for us in life. And in fact, the difference between weak and struggling Christians and strong Christians is weak and struggling Christians can only see God in the good times. And they only want to worship God in the good times. And they only want to bless God in the good times. Strong Christians are people who can see God and seek God in both the good times and in the bad times. And so I know I've kind of taken this story in Matthew chapter 2 and I've read between the lines, but I want to take us back to this one part of the story where in Matthew chapter 2 verse 11 it says, these magi entered the house and they saw the child, they saw Jesus with his mother, Mary, and they were, Even though this wasn't what they expected him to be in Jerusalem, but they see him now in this poverty level house in Bethlehem, but they see something special and they bow down and worship him. And then it says they opened their treasure chests and they gave him gifts. You know, sometimes when life doesn't turn out the way we want it to, we withdraw. We hold things closer to us. In this instance, they still bless. They still give. You know, they're still generous. Because they sense that there is something special in this baby. Even though everything doesn't seem to fit right, there's something special in this baby. And they worship and they give him gifts. And today, I'm just asking you to look at your life. And this year at Christmas, maybe everything isn't perfect. This year, 2020-25, isn't what you expected. You know, wasn't what you hoped for. Maybe you're a little bit disappointed in this year. But what I want to challenge you to do is to see God and seek him even in the imperfection. Let's pray. Lord, help us today to realize that you are with us. You are here. Even when my life may literally stink, it may not be perfect, it may be far from perfect. You are here. Just because my life is imperfect doesn't mean that you don't love me or that you don't exist. You are here. And I pray today, Lord, that we will find strength from you, draw resources from you to face these days. Help us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.